Hello, beautiful people. Welcome to this week's episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW LP Brattleboro. I'm your host and producer of the show, Olga Peters, and this is where we talk about how everything in Montpelier shakes out for the rest of us. I want to welcome to the show John Walters, the journalist behind the Vermont Political Observer. Thank you, John, for being here.
Thank you for inviting me.
Well, one thing that really caught my attention when I was reading through the Vermont Political Observer um, work that you've written lately is once again, I'm reminded why I like doing the show that so much we might look at an issue and it seems like it stands on its own, but it's like so connected. Everything's sort of like this Velcro little ball that gets rolled under the bed and comes out covered in all sorts of dust bunnies. And I felt like that a little bit. Not that your work is dusty, but
You walk into a cobweb, and pretty soon you're like, yeah,
yeah,
it's all
you're
me.
like, get it off me, get it off me. So I really felt that way reading some of your recent work. But where I'd like to start is with just kind of revisiting something we've talked about, but I always like to kind of close the loop on things a little bit um, on news stories because so often we write like the first day Gatsby headline, but then we never revisit an issue.
Yep.
So I would like to spend a couple minutes revisiting prediction markets.
Mhm.
Like Kalshi is the big one folks see.
Yep.
Um, yeah, you wrote a piece about kind of people betting on Vermont politics, and I think it left you a little disappointed.
Well, I mean, the big thing is that hardly anybody is betting on Vermont politics. And I guess in some ways that's a good thing. If you think that betting on real world consequential events has, carries a moral price. If you're betting on something like when war will start or when we will bomb a country or, you know, stuff like that, then you can find yourself very easily rooting for war and for bad stuff to happen. In the case of Vermont politics, I was just curious after I wrote something about the prediction markets a few weeks ago. I was curious, like, can you actually bet on Vermont politics? And the answer is yes, you can. There are a few prediction markets open on Polymarket and Kalshi, and they've gotten stunningly little traffic. Um, a few hundred to a few $1,000s at most has been bet on things like who's going to be the Democratic nominee for governor, who's going to be the Republican nominee for governor, which party is the next governor going to be a member of. A few other things have risen to the level where there are actually markets in place, but not very many. And by comparison, like, um, if a few $1,000s has been wagered on the gubernatorial contest, several $100,000 might be wagered on one specific University of Vermont basketball game, which shows you
Priorities.
yeah. And the only particular potential downside to this is the small markets are the ones that are most ripe for abuse.
Hmm,
I have,
interesting.
in sort of the discussions about what the prediction markets are doing to the world of sports, a lot of the real concerns about are not about, like, pro basketball or, big time college basketball like Duke and Michigan and all those teams. It's the tiny schools you've never heard of. And, the prediction markets can suddenly, like, go in one direction or another. And you can have, bets on whether one individual player will score more or fewer points than expected in a given contest. There's a big scandal right now in baseball. A couple of Cleveland pitchers are probably never going to pitch again because they were involved in wagers on, like, the first pitch they threw in a given game and whether it was going to be a ball or a strike.
Oh,
That's
interesting.
something that they had absolute control over.
Yeah.
Oops, my hand slipped, it was a ball. Um, and they are accused of conniving with people in the betting markets to basically fix that wager. And in these small markets, this kind of stuff can go relatively undetected compared to like the big bets. There's already been a case of a California politician who was suspended by Kalshi for wagering on his own candidacy. Um, and, you know, it wouldn't take much for, I mean, what if a candidate found a way to, put a wager through a cutout or through a friend or whatever on his own campaign and then, like, purposely lost? Uh,
Mm,
uh, Stuff like that can happen and probably will happen. And fortunately for us, our uh, prediction markets are so tiny. There's very little potential payoff, at least so far. If we start, I'm going to have to try to check them periodically and see if any more money rolls into those things. Because if more money does roll in, and like suddenly the odds go way up or way down on Phil Scott, for instance.
right.
If the odds suddenly go way down on Phil Scott, does that mean that somebody knows that he might be not running for reelection? It may or may not be a potential scandal, but it's definitely in the category of things that make you go,
Hmm.
and make you wonder. Um, and that's kind of the toxicity of the prediction markets, is that everything is in this giant pool and it's all up for grabs for potential money making, not just is this the right thing or the wrong thing, and how are we deciding this on the basis of what's best?
Hmm.
Or some people, the odds to me on Phil Scott being the next governor seem a little bit low.
Huh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That probably means that some people are taking the short side just on the chance of making a big killing, from a wager on John Rogers or, somebody like that. But it
Yeah,
does
they're
kind
trying
of
to
make you
play the
wonder,
house rather than.
some friend of John Rogers knows that Phil Scott is kind of getting tired of this whole thing and wants to just race cars again.
Hmm.
Um,
It's true too.
So I'll be checking the markets once in a while to see if there's a sudden influx of money. I checked before we began taping this podcast, and there hasn't been. There's been like no movement at all, as far as I can tell. Still very minimal wagers, and stunningly uninformed wagers, it seems to me. The two leading contenders by a long shot for the Democratic nominee are two people who are not running for governor.
Oh, interesting.
Treasurer
Yes.
Treasurer Mike Pichak and Attorney General Charity Clark. Um, and the person who's a distant third behind them is House Speaker Jill Krowinski, who I have not heard a peep about her running for governor. Um, so, the only person who has declared a candidacy for the Democratic nomination, Amanda Janu, does not appear anywhere. Um, so, I don't know. I titled my blog post about that, "The Stupidity of Small Crowds," and that's kind of where we're at. And I guess, on balance, it's a dumb thing, but it's probably a good thing. I'd rather that than have a lot of money rolling into, prop bets on who's going to win our elections.
Yeah. Yes. There's enough pressure on them already. Last thing we need is more financial incentive.
Yeah.
Now, John, I believe you wrote a piece. Speaking of finances, the Secretary of State's office election filing, not election filing, I'm sorry, finance filing was just a couple weeks ago, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And what
Um,
did you find?
it was noteworthy because the way our state campaign finance filing schedule works, we just ended a very long period where there were no filings. Um, in the off year, they had to file one like last July.
Hmm.
There's not another deadline until mid-March, which is a very long time.
A lot
And
can happen in those few months.
yeah, and we won't have another one until this July 1st, which is only a few weeks before the primary. So in some ways, this is our best measure of how these races are shaping up. And um, the bulk of the most sort of well-endowed race at this point is the Democratic race for lieutenant governor, where we have two reasonably well-known, established Democratic contenders, Molly Gray, the former lieutenant governor, and Ryan McLaren, who is not well known publicly. He's never run for office before, but he has been in Democratic circles for quite a while, and he has been a staffer to Peter Welch for
Oh,
quite a
right.
few
Yes.
years. And uh, there is nothing better in terms of a credential inside Democratic circles than being a member of a congressional delegation team. It goes a long way in connecting you with party insiders, party officials, and donors. So, he jumped into the race. And both of them uh, took in a little bit over $150,000. Um, and that's over like the last 9 months since last July. But that's a lot of money for a lieutenant governor's race.
Yeah, it is.
It's, you know, in a normal year, that would be enough to fund an entire campaign, primary and general. In this case, they're going to spend a lot of that money in the primary because they're battling it out for the Democratic nomination. And then they'll have to turn around and run against, presumably, the incumbent Republican, John Rogers. So it's almost certainly going to break records for the lieutenant governor's race. Um, but both of them are off to strong starts. Both of them have, good connections in party circles and with donors, and they've racked up a lot of endorsements from party officials and elected officials alike. So that's going to be a lively contest. And, by far, like Governor Phil Scott didn't raise very much money. Amanda Janeau, the only declared Democratic candidate for governor, did well, considering that she had only announced her candidacy a couple of weeks before the deadline. She
Mm.
raised like $80,000, which is a good start, and much better than the last two or three gubernatorial candidates did. Um, so she's off to a promising start. Um, Otherwise, there wasn't a lot that was really noteworthy. One other thing I thought was noteworthy is that Treasurer Mike Pichak, who has said he has basically all but ruled out a run for governor this year. There's a lot of speculation last year that he would run against Phil Scott or against run for the Democratic nomination, and he has largely backed away from that, although he's not closed the door on it.
Mm-hmm.
The interesting thing in his filing on March 15th was that he has spent a ton of money on like expensive outside campaign consultants who are doing things like, sending out a lot of fundraising email messages and probably text messages as well. And, sort of like preparing sort of glossy campaign materials and all that. And it's like, if he's running for reelection as treasurer, he does not need to do that. You know, he has faced a unrecognized and completely unfunded Republican opponent each of the last two cycles. And he's almost certainly going to again this year. So, the obvious thing, and he is actively fundraising, which he does not need to do, although considering his burn rate, he kind of does.
Mm-hmm.
But why he's burning all this cash, I have no idea.
Mm-hmm.
I think I am projecting base political motives onto him, and I do not know if this is right. But from my perspective, there are only two possible explanations. Well, one possible explanation really is that he wants to maintain his widely perceived status as the top Democratic contender for governor the next time, whenever he steps into the race, whether that's this
Gotcha.
year or 2028. Speculation is he's going to wait until Phil Scott is, retiring. Um, and he's spending a lot of money to, like, keep his engine running hot, basically. Um, and and um, that's the only possible explanation. The other thing is, I think he is leaving the door open just a tiny crack in case Phil Scott doesn't run for reelection. And if that happens, then he would still be poised to jump in,
To kind of pivot and
and he would be in a position to be the front runner, even if he was entering the race months after other people.
gotcha.
Um,
Well,
so
I can see the wisdom in that.
yeah, I mean, he's taking advantage of the fact that he is the strongest fundraiser in Democratic circles outside of the congressional delegation. Um, and, he is the most likely to, um, you know, be the front runner for the Democratic nomination whenever he decides to pursue it.
Hmm.
And he's spending a lot of money, and he's trying to raise even more money in order to maintain his position. And, from a purely political point of view, I get that. Uh, in terms of being a loyal Democrat, I kind of wish he would, cool his jets. Well, I wish he would do one of two things: either jump in the race himself, or because he's, I think, the only Democrat who could seriously challenge Phil Scott at this point, or he should take a bunch of his money, or he should redirect his fundraising apparatus to a Democratic gubernatorial victory fund and just dedicate all that money to whoever wins the nomination,
Mm,
or it's him or somebody else. And if he
interesting.
was
Yeah.
operating as a loyal Democrat in the best interests of the party, he would be doing something like that. Or if you don't want to take that radical a step, or maybe it violates some campaign finance law I don't know about, then, start sending fundraising messages asking people not to give to him right now, but to give to Democratic candidates who really need the support. But he's a politician, and I don't expect him to do any of that.
Well, one thing that catches my attention of everything you just said here is I guess I'm a little surprised that the Democratic Party, there seems to be a lot of people and resources going towards the lieutenant governor
Mhm.
position rather than towards the governor
Well,
spot. And
no,
I'm wondering, do you have any thoughts or insight into that, why that might be happening?
well, I mean, you're right. It's 300,000 more or less to the, actually a little bit more to the lieutenant governor's race in Democratic candidates versus 80,000 to the gubernatorial. And that's certainly way out of whack. There are two obvious reasons for that. One is that both Molly Gray and Ryan McLaren have much better connections to the donor community in the Democratic Party, and the business community, et cetera, than Amanda Janeau does. Um, and the other is they think it's a winnable seat. Uh,
Mm,
you see, Lieutenant Governor John Rogers as vulnerable. I would agree with that assessment. I think his victory was more a matter of the general depression of the Democratic vote in 2024 and the general elevation of the Republican vote, mostly because of property taxes.
hmm.
Um, and, Rogers was running against an incumbent, David Zuckerman, who had substantial baggage. And mostly what I mean by that is that he really was not well liked in Democratic circles.
Hmm.
They did not do a lot to support his candidacy. And a lot of Democrats, I think, were just as happy to be rid of him, even if it meant having a Republican as lieutenant governor. So at this point, with Zuckerman safely out of the way, again, being the cynical political observer that I am, there are a lot of Democrats who see opportunity and the need to retake the lieutenant governor's office, this time in the hands of a mainstream Democrat. Um, and I think, that may have been emphasized to some extent by a few weeks ago, the Senate vote on the Supreme Court nominee, the state Supreme Court nominee, whose name I forget right now, Michael something, former U.S. attorney in Vermont who had actively argued for, Trump immigration policies in court. Um, he was one of the governor's nominees for a vacancy on the state Supreme Court. The vote in the state Senate was a 15-15 tie, which meant that Rogers broke the tie in favor of Scott's nominee. And that was a pretty consequential vote.
Hmm.
And, there may be Democrats who are realizing that having John Rogers in the number two position isn't all unicorns and rainbows.
Right.
But
Are
yeah,
we talking about Michael Drescher?
yeah, Michael Drescher. So
Um, oh, sorry, go ahead.
anyway, there's a lot more Democratic attention and money going into the lieutenant governor's race. And I don't know if you want to segue into this right now. There are some real signs of like bitterness developing in the early stages of the race for lieutenant governor.
Yeah, well, what I find interesting about, yes, let's segue to some of the conversations happening in the party because you use the word support a couple times in talking about campaign finance, and it feels based on what I read on your website that maybe some folks are feeling a little unsupported as Democrats by the Democratic Party.
Yeah,
Um, is that your take on it?
yeah. I mean, I sort of rolled four different things into one blog post because they seem to be of a piece. And the idea is, there are some people who are in Democratic circles who are kind of going public with some pretty harsh words about their own party.
Hmm.
Um, the number one instance of this is Ryan McLaren, one of the two main candidates for lieutenant governor, who's has a lot of connections in the party and has been a state party official himself. He sent a pretty blistering letter to state party leadership, accusing them of putting their thumb on the scale. He didn't say Molly Gray, but in favor of other candidates, quote unquote. He accused state officials of pressuring people who had endorsed McLaren to withdraw their endorsements. He accused them of allocating resources in a way that favored other candidates, quote unquote, and disfavored his candidacy. He didn't like publicly release this letter, but you write a letter like that, and somebody is going to like get it and send it to me and other people. It's going to get out in one way or another.
It is not a quiet letter.
It ended with a threat of legal action if the party didn't apologize and change its policies
Oh,
and make
yeah.
clear what its policies were on endorsements. Um, it was a stunning, it would have been stunning coming from anybody who was running for a Democratic nomination to be that openly critical of the state party. It was especially stunning to me coming from Ryan McLaren, who has been in party circles for a long time and has a lot of friends and a lot of networks and a lot of connections. And it speaks to something developing. It's starting to look like it could be a really nasty race between Gray and McLaren.
Mm,
Would be sad. Um, would not be great for Democratic prospects in November for winning the office. Um, but, you know, stuff happens when
yeah.
politics gets really sort of like to the metaphorical, what cutting stage. And that seems to be where we're going with the lieutenant governor's race. I pointed out to a few other things that have also happened lately. One of which is that the Democratic candidate for state Senate in Orleans County in the Northeast Kingdom, Gaston Bathalon, if I'm pronouncing his last name correctly, who declared his candidacy last October,
Yeah.
very early, um, suddenly withdrew from the race last week. And apparently it was over disagreements with the state party on fundraising and tactics and resources and all of that stuff. And he just up and quit. And that leaves the Democrats without a campaign or a candidate in a very crucial race. You know, one of the Democrats' top priorities this year is to retake some of the Senate seats that they lost in 24.
Hmm.
And the Orleans County seat was in Democratic hands for a long time. Bobby Starr, who was a decidedly centrist Democrat, but you know, Bathalon seemed to be an ideal candidate, military background, centrist agenda, pro Northeast Kingdom. Um, and, you know, with him out of the race, the Democrats have like a month and a half to identify another candidate in that race. Um, I think it's probably a safe Republican seat at this point, and that it changed over the years, and it was masqueraded by Bobby Starr's personal popularity. But if the Democrats are ever going to take back that seat, this is the year to do it because the Republican incumbent, Sam Douglas, resigned in disgrace. They have an appointed senator in his place, John Morley, who has never run for election. So if he wins this year, he's probably going to be safe as an incumbent. And if the Democrats have no one to oppose him or a last minute, oh my God, who've we got in here, um, then their chances of winning that seat have gone down by quite a bit.
Hmm.
And then there was not to mention a competing podcast.
You are more than welcome to. The more the merrier.
Um, there's no A in Creamy, which is co-hosted by Andy Julo, former state senator from the islands, the Champlain Islands, and Joanna Grossman, who used to be the chair of the Chittenden County Democrats. She managed Julo's campaign in 2024, and she is now running for state senate in the Chittenden Southeast District, and she's effectively challenging three incumbent Democrats. Um, but both of them went on the podcast this week and began with some pretty sharp words for the Democratic Party. Uh, Grossman basically accused the state party of tipping the scales in favor of the incumbents, um, and abandoning their traditional stance of neutrality in primaries. And Julo answered back with some kind of sharp complaints about how much the party did or did not do to help his reelection bid in 2024.
Hmm.
And, you know, their podcast is like, you know, they are both, you know, committed and loyal Democrats.
Right.
And their podcast is usually kind of pretty friendly. And for them to go public, as they did, is pretty noteworthy in my book. And on the heels of Gaston Bathalon's withdrawal and this really toxic letter from Ryan McLaren to the state committee. Well, to be fair, it was written by McLaren's campaign manager. But, you know, this is all a bunch of stuff that's happened basically in the last week.
Hmm.
Um, and yeah, to me, taken together, it's kind of a sign that all is not well in Democratic circles. And
So,
that could be a serious impediment to their chances of rebuilding their majorities and maybe taking back the lieutenant governorship or maybe even the governorship this fall.
okay, thank you, John. That kind of answered the my question. We only have a couple minutes and we need to hear from some underwriters. But I did want to just get your thoughts quickly on, I know this is interesting to you and me because we follow the legislature, but in the big picture of like governing Vermont and making sure good policy gets created and that we create a Vermont that works for as many people as possible, does this kind of inside baseball matter, or does it have knock-on effects to the community as a whole? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, if you think that the Democratic agenda is better than Phil Scott's agenda, then you don't want to see this. You don't want to see internal disputes breaking out in public
Mm,
at the beginning of a campaign season. Um, and you certainly don't want to see a race for lieutenant governor where the two candidates are kind of going for each other's throats. Um, at least they're in the early stages of that. Um, Maybe cooler heads will prevail, but this is like if you want to elect more Democrats, this is not a great situation to see in at the beginning of a campaign cycle. And these campaign cycles in Vermont are extremely short.
mm-hmm.
So, if there's money and effort and time and resources and energy being, you know, put toward intra-party fights rather than advancing the Democratic cause, then that's a good thing for Republicans and a bad thing for Democrats.
Yeah.
The Democrats would say that, they have an agenda that is more pro moving Democrat forward, moving Vermont forward.
Right.
And they specifically say that in this age of Trump and ICE and all this stuff, that the Democrats are going to put up more of a fight against Trump than Phil Scott does. So, if you believe them and believe that Vermont should be putting up more of a fight, then you want to see more Democrats in office in November. Um, so they still have the wind at their backs because this is probably going to be an anti-Trump swing, wave election, but they're not helping themselves. Let's put it that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think what I would add to that is, and I would say this would be the issue whether this was happening within the Democratic or the Progressive or the Republican Party, is that so often we talk about we don't want our elections to just be horse races. We want them to also be about the issues. But unfortunately, when there's infighting like this, the issues kind of slip to the back.
Yeah,
And unfortunately, I think we're at a crucial part in our democracy where we really do need to be have a really good grip of the issues and where people stand on them.
yeah. And I
Uh,
think this is probably getting into something we should save for after the underwriting announcements. But this is a case where our best hope is not with the politicians. Our best hope is with the No Kings movement and
mm,
Indivisible and the independent groups and the millions and millions of people who turn out for anti-Trump rallies and really keep the pressure on the Republicans and on the Democrats.
and we will be talking about that after the break. So thank you, John. That was a perfect segue. So hang tight, folks. John and I will be back right after we hear from some underwriters here on WVEW. Hello, beautiful people. Welcome to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW LP Brattleboro. If you're just joining us, I'm Olga Peters, the host and producer of the show, and I am speaking with John Walters, who is the journalist behind the Vermont Political Observer. Um, Before we dive back into the conversation, I want to quickly say thank you to BCTV for taking the video version of this show and sharing it with media centers around the state, as well as remind listeners that the views and opinions of everyone on the Montpelier Happy Hour are those of the hosts and the guests and nobody else. Right, John?
That's right. And I would put in a plug for people to track down their community access TV station or the stations in Vermont that they can get if they have cable or other services because community access is generally very short funded and doesn't have a lot of resources, but there are some really talented people who are putting out some really good content, community access channels around the state. And
Yeah.
it's worth sort of diving into that pool and maybe checking out their websites to see the stuff they're doing. You know, Central Vermont's Orca Media does a lot of coverage of public events They routinely post video of Governor Scott's press conferences, for instance,
Hmm.
and they do other stuff around the Capitol. And I have seen great stuff done by other community access stations around the state, and I would urge people to not ignore them.
Yeah, and I would add to that that especially with like the meeting coverage, they help expand access to local government in ways that, especially in our shrinking media environment, newspaper environment, is really important.
Yep,
And they give a place where folks from the community can have a microphone and have a platform, which I feel is also really important.
yep.
So thank you for that plug, John. So before the break, we had been talking about basically, well, kind of that thing about power and voices and who's in control, which I think brings us to a piece you wrote in response to the ICE incident in South Burlington. And uh, you had a great title about we how badly we need our agitators.
Yeah, I think it played off the one of the police officials at a legislative hearing, blamed a lot of the trouble at the ICE raid on South Burlington on agitators. And my title for that piece was "Those agitators are democracy's best hope, sir." Um, and which is not to say the police were all wrong and the agitators, quote unquote, were all right, but this is a situation with Trump, you know, kind of trampling the Constitution
Hmm.
and striking fear into the hearts of every person of color who lives here, who do not know when they might be swept up.
Hmm.
I've heard from people of color who just routinely carry their passports with them, which is something they never thought they would have to do. And these are not immigrants with thick accents. These are people who were born and raised here, either in Vermont or in America. So it is a situation that is designed more to inspire fear than to enforce the law or weed out the bad actors among our immigrant community. Um, the ICE raid was a complete bust in terms of law enforcement. They did not find the person they thought they were going to find, who it turns out they never identified properly. They took into custody three people who did not need to be taken into custody and were quickly released, but they were released within a few days. But they were thoroughly traumatized in the process.
Yeah.
A major thoroughfare in South Burlington was closed for hours. There was a huge conflict between protesters and ICE and local and state police.
Hmm.
And none of that was necessary. None of it did anything to make our nation or our state more secure. And, that's been the truth with the entire ICE operation nationwide. The vast majority of people swept up do not have any criminal history or any pending criminal charges. Many of them have pending immigration cases, but those are historically and traditionally adjudicated through civil processes, not through criminal processes of, arrest and detention indefinitely.
Hmm.
Um, so, it's an awful situation, and I'm not plowing any new ground in that regard. But, it came home to roost right in our backyard, and it could happen anytime, anywhere, even though we kind of see ourselves as different and special and somewhat insulated from all of this. We could be the next Minneapolis at any moment. Um, the only thing that's probably shielded us so far is our size.
Hmm. I was
Uh,
about to say that, yeah.
but this is, and once something like this happens, then the role of state and local police is honestly is complicated.
Hmm.
I mean, you know, you can disagree with the state police actions and tactics. And like, for instance, the state police were wearing all the tactical gear, including bandanas over their faces, um, characteristic of ICE.
Right.
And they put on a menacing presence that was very much ICE-like. And I don't think that was a good thing. Uh,
Hmm.
if they were roughing up protesters or using pepper spray indiscriminately or tasers or whatever, um, that was not a good thing. However, they did have two legitimate purposes there, and for those purposes, it's a good thing that they were there. One is they do have an obligation to help with executing court-ordered legitimate warrants, and ICE did have a warrant for the guy who it turned out wasn't there, but they did have a warrant to go into that house. And the other is they do have an obligation to keep the peace, and they did serve as a buffer between ICE and the protesters,
That is a good point.
and not a perfect buffer
No.
by any means. But, you know, it's quite possible that if ICE was out there defending itself against a larger group of protesters, there might have been another Minneapolis shooting.
Hmm.
Things might have been worse. Um, so we have to keep that in mind. We can't just say, state police back off. Um, it is on balance better that they're there than that they're not there.
Hmm.
Do
Hmm.
we have to take a long, hard look at what happened that day? Yes, we do. Do we have to try to figure out where the police might refine their tactics? Should they avoid wearing bandanas over their faces, for instance? That would be high on my list.
That would be high on my list as well. Yeah.
What are their rules of engagement, and all of that? And so that is something that I hope the House and Senate Judiciary Committees have held two hearings so far,
Hmm.
were the state police and local police answering questions, um, and defending their actions. And the second was a public hearing at which any member of the public could sign up for a short speaking slot. And that was held on Wednesday, the most recent Wednesday, as we are taping this on a Friday. Um, and I am kind of hoping that there will be a third hearing where advocates for groups like the ACLU and migrant justice and other people in some position of organized resistance or counterbalance get to weigh in responsibly on what they want the police to do and not do, and really drill down on this and figure out how we can make things a little better, which is kind of all we can do. We're stuck being part of this nationwide Trump crackdown.
Yeah.
And again, it can happen anytime here. And I talked to the chair of the House Judiciary Committee about this whole thing. And, he and his Senate counterpart have been doing a lot of work this year to try to develop legislation to rein in some of the worst aspects of what ICE is up to and to
Hmm.
provide a counterbalance. For instance, one piece of legislation would establish a right to sue for people who feel their rights were violated or their safety was violated or they were injured. Um, but their power to do anything to block what ICE is doing or Border Patrol is extremely limited.
Yeah.
Um, and so don't expect big things of the legislative leadership or Governor Scott for that matter. Um, this is why I headlined that post saying those agitators are kind of our best hope because they're the ones who are not official actors, are not legally responsible in any official means, and preferably acting in nonviolent manner, but keeping up the pressure,
Hmm.
making it as
Well,
unpleasant as possible for these things to happen on our soil.
well, and let's be honest, when you look at our political history as a country, when you look at tools in the Constitution
Hmm.
for the average citizen, agitation is what we have. We have the First Amendment, we have newspapers, we have the right to protest. I
Hmm.
mean, and the courts.
Yep.
These are the tools we have. And so people have the right to use them.
Yep. Yep. And that's why, no King's Day. Every time they hold one, it breaks records.
Hmm.
Um, and the Trump agenda is getting more unpopular by the day. The question is, can he outrace that with his efforts to limit democracy and subvert the 2026 election and, you know, advance and establish his regime of terror tactics under the guise of enforcing our borders?
Hmm.
Um, it's a race, and our established processes are always going to be slower than he is.
Yeah.
So we can't sit back and wait for official processes to block the
Hmm.
gross excesses of the Trump regime,
Well, you know,
in my opinion.
well, yeah, because one thing the Trump administration has gotten very good at is creating chaos
Yep.
and then walking away and leaving a mess for other people to clean up.
And throwing out so much stuff out there that you just can't keep track of it all,
Hmm.
and which increases their chances of being able to get away with at least some of what they want to do. So,
So you mentioned a couple potential policies that might be going into place to push back as much as a state can push back. Are there any policies happening or new rules at the department level that you've been watching that concern you? Um,
well, that's probably a lead in to the corrections department. Um, which is, part of the state government that is actively complicit in Trump's immigration crackdown because I think the last figure I saw, which is now a few months old, was that about 900 people have been uh, jailed for some period of time for immigration reasons in Vermont prisons and jails. And that's probably, at least seven or 800 that had no basis for being detained.
it's a lot of people.
And, that is having, uh, so the corrections department is limited in what they can do. And I think somewhat even more limited in what they're willing to do to try to make the situation less toxic. Um, the one thing that came to light recently is that the new corrections commissioner, John Murad, who was the former Burlington City Police Chief, recently made a policy change that advocates for immigrants say has significantly reduced access to detainees uh, by their lawyers.
How is
Uh,
that possible? If
well, his version is that he is reinstating past policy that had been changed by his predecessor, Nicholas Demmel.
hmm,
Um, what seems to be the primary issue here is limiting um, attorneys from bringing electronic devices into prison, which I think for general security purposes is maybe a reasonable thing to do, but they use those devices for like translation and documentation and various other purposes. And, Murad is trying to institute, like, the provision of corrections department approved devices to take the place or, better translation services or whatever. But this seems like absolutely the wrong time to be limiting access uh, to detainees, right after the ice raids in South Burlington. Um, it doesn't seem like great timing. Um, and it seems like whether or not it's congruent with past policy, it seems like the wrong time to be making it harder for lawyers to access their clients, many of whom are detained for no legal reason.
Hmm.
And that's an example to me of the state going stepping over the line in terms of how complicit they are with what Trump is doing.
Hmm.
Um, so I'm not sure if that's something the legislature can look at. I'm not sure. It's again, there's not a lot we can do, but there are some things we could do. And one could wish for an administration that was a little less timid about confronting Trump and finding ways to act to mitigate the situation, however we
Hmm.
can, and ease the status and outlook of immigrants who are in custody, many of whom there's no good reason for them to be in custody.
Hmm.
So, there is a process of legislation being looked at and vetted, and I hope that will continue. But again, don't count on that process to save anybody's bacon.
Yeah. Dire words there, John.
Dire situation.
Yeah. Well, I feel for us right now in Vermont because we are for we do place a lot of emphasis on community. And everyone shows up to that differently, but it does feel right now that the pressure we're getting from the Trump administration is going right into the roots of that, community, the sense of safety, the sense of cohesion, the sense that someone will show up and help you if you need it. And that just increases fear for everybody.
Yeah. And, my concern, broadly speaking, is I think Trump, no matter how deep his dementia might be or not, um, has to realize at some pretty fundamental level that he's on borrowed time.
Hmm.
Policies are deeply unpopular. The war is driving his negatives into unprecedented territory.
Hmm.
The economy is saddled with massive oil price increases. The ICE regime is deeply unpopular, and he has slightly pulled it back because of that. And the Republicans know they're in deep trouble in the midterms. Um, and he's old, and probably knows that no matter how much he might openly muse about running for reelection, that he's unlikely to be able to do that, and or unlikely to live that long.
Hmm.
Um,
That's interesting.
and that you know his ability to do what he wants might end after the November election. He doesn't have much time left. My worry is that he will put the pedal to the metal and try to get as much done as he can in these next several months before the midterms. And that includes restricting voting access and, limiting, handicapping the mail service and, trying to create a national voter checklist, which he could then use to pursue the almost entirely imaginary cases of vote fraud that he is so anxious about. Because the only way, to me, the only way for him to win the midterms is to severely suppress turnout
Hmm.
um,
Hmm.
and, put enough people into a state of complete fear that they would reflexively vote to maintain the status quo. Um, so that's my concern. I mean, he's surrounded by signs that his power is waning.
Yeah.
How does he respond to that? Does he moderate what he's doing, or does he try to get everything he possibly can before he's out of office?
My kind of concern slash curiosity. or questions I ask is a lot of attention is placed on Trump and our attention is placed on Trump and the Trump administration, as it should be.
Mhm.
At the same time, I worry about what level is this administration the disease and which level it's the symptom.
Mhm.
And after the November elections, even if Trump's power is limited, I worry about, you talk about that dictator's toolbox, the authoritarian toolbox, like what tools are still
Mhm.
at able to be used,
Will
if not by Trump, by somebody else.
will a future Democratic president and Congress have the guts to uh, make significant cutbacks in the bloated budgets for ICE and Border Patrol and the Defense Department,
Yep,
where Trump
that's a
has
good question.
thrown uncountable billions and even trillions of dollars into this establishment that will then be established. And, is a Democratic president going to be willing to take the potential heat for loosening the control of our borders, quote unquote, by returning to a status quo that was pretty oppressive anyway? I mean, no country in the world has secure borders.
Hmm.
Sorry, they don't. Borders are not walls. They are imaginary lines that you can't see or couldn't see if there wasn't like a sentry post or something like that. You don't see them across the countryside. Um, and no country has ever been able to absolutely control who lives there and who doesn't. He's chasing a chimera.
Hmm.
Will we be able to unhook ourselves from that when we have a long and storied history of overreacting to potential threats?
Well,
Uh,
and also there's, whether you agree with them or not, there's a lot of reasons folks have supported Trump. Other voters have supported Trump, and the economy gets pointed out a lot as one of the reasons. And if our economy is still a mess, will that change anybody's opinion around whether or not we need someone like Trump?
yep. I
And who
mean,
will they vote for next?
part of the dynamic is, we are in such a perilous state that we need a strong figure to just grab control of stuff.
Hmm.
Don't let it drift and don't let things sort of happen out of, neglect or whatever. And, if you gotta, break a few eggs to make an omelet, then so be it. Um, I do wonder if we return to some measure of civility when the entire Republican Party apparatus is in Trump's pocket right now. How are they going to react to Trump's inevitable absence? Um, and there was a lot of talk after the Tea Party back in 2010, 2011, that the Republican Party would have to tack back to the middle at some point.
Hmm.
And that was before Trump came on the scene, and we
Hmm.
know how that all went. Um, I don't know. I mean, almost every Republican elected official in the country is uh, a Trumper.
Hmm.
Some of that is by we got to get along to go along, or we'll be drummed out of office. But a lot of that is because there has been a purification in Republican ranks. And, there just aren't that many people like Phil Scott left for all of Phil Scott's flaws. He is an old-fashioned Republican, not a totalitarian Republican.
Hmm.
Um, and, what happens to the Republican Party after Trump exits? Do they find another strong man? Um, do they moderate their stance a little bit if they get their asses kicked often enough in elections? I don't know. They don't have a history of tacking back to the center. The Democrats do, but the Republicans don't. So I don't know where this is all going. Um, I do know that, we have a lot of periods of our history that are pretty dark in terms of civil rights and civil liberties and the treatment of, people of color and women.
Hmm.
And, you know, Trump is feeding into some very strong, very deep, very nasty impulses in the American psyche.
Yeah.
So, um, is that a note on which to end this podcast?
Whew. That's it seems like the last few conversations we've had together have all ended on these very doom and gloom notes, which is a little ironic because one thing I know about you, John, is even though you do not mince words in your at the Vermont Political Observer, you are, do I dare say, on the more optimistic side of the spectrum in that you're willing to keep showing up, which I think is something a lot of reporters, they do share this optimism that if the information's out there, people can make better decisions and we can make the community a better place. Um, but
And
right now,
if you asked me to like place a prediction market bet on whether the country will move back to the left, eventually within the next few years, I would probably bet on the side of yes, it will.
mhm,
Because that tends to be what happens is our politics is a pendulum, not a freight train.
yeah,
Um,
this is a good point.
but how much damage will be done and how much permanent change will have been made to our system and
Hmm.
its tolerance for excesses. Will we ever return, say, for instance, to a regime where ethics are expected of our office holders? I don't know. It would be nice. But I think there will be, at least to some degree, the pendulum will swing in the other direction. I think it's already in many ways starting to happen. And I don't think that Trump, no matter what he tries to do with executive orders and ranting at reporters and going on social media outbursts, um, he's not going to be able to stop that. I really don't think. So, on balance, I'm optimistic. It's just not going to be easy. It's going to be a struggle, and it's going to take a lot of resistance activity as well as activity through the political systems at our disposal.
Hmm. I also feel it will take a lot of, how do I put this? Planning, preparation, to make sure that when the chaos happens, we've got things in place so that we're not always having to just react. We can actually respond and be proactive. Um, because otherwise we're at the mercy of the chaos.
And a lot of Vermonters have stepped into the breach in various ways,
Yeah.
from supporting, helping immigrants to networking to the kind of like phone trees and stuff that make people show up when there's an ice raid. I would much rather be living in Vermont than Alabama or Montana or Idaho or
Mhm.
any other deep red state. We are doing stuff and we are having an effect. And, may that continue to be the case.
And on that note, John Walters from the Vermont Political Observer, can people find your work?
It's a blog called the Vermont Political Observer. And yes, blogs do still exist. And the web address is very simple. It's thevpo.org. And if you search for the Vermont Political Observer, or I have entered like the VPO in a Google search, and I'm up there near the top. So it's not hard to find me.
Well, thank you. And as always, the Montpelier Happy Hour is on WVEW every Friday at 2 and rebroadcasted on Wednesday mornings. And wherever you can find your podcasts, I hope everyone has a good weekend and take care.